For 5,000 years, Stonehenge stood in silence, refusing to give up its secrets to every chisel, every shovel, and every theory ever thrown at it. And then a machine started reading it. Not digging, not excavating, just scanning, processing. Pattern matching at speeds no human brain can match. And what it found buried beneath those ancient stones, not in them, not around them, but underneath them, was so unexpected, so geometrically precise, so deliberately engineered that the archaeologists staring at the data did not celebrate. They went quiet, because what the technology revealed wasn't just an ancient monument, it was something far more organized, far more intentional, and far more sophisticated than anything 5,000 years of guesswork had ever come close to imagining. And when you hear all of it, laid out piece by piece, the way the data actually assembled itself, you will understand why the word terrifying keeps showing up in the mouths of the researchers who know this material best. Before we get into what the machines found, you need to understand what Stonehenge actually is. And more importantly, what it isn't. What you see in photographs, the famous ring of enormous upright stones, capped with horizontal lintels standing on a plain in southern England, is a ruin. Most people look at it and think they're seeing Stonehenge. They're not. They're seeing what's left of Stonehenge after 5 millennia of collapse, theft, weathering, and deliberate dismantling. At its peak, around 2200 BC, the monument contained approximately 157 stones arranged in multiple concentric rings and horseshoe formations. Today, there are 63 complete stones remaining, with 12 others in fragments, many of them partially buried or fallen. The structure you see in every photograph is roughly 40% of what once stood there. You are looking at ruins and calling them a monument. That distinction matters enormously because every theory ever proposed about Stonehenge's purpose, every debate about whether it was a temple, a calendar, a burial ground, a healing center, has been based on an incomplete structure. We have been arguing about a jigsaw puzzle with most of the pieces missing. And what the AI-assisted scanning revealed was that the missing pieces were not gone at all. They were just below the surface, waiting. The project that started rewriting everything was called the Stonehenge Hidden Landscapes Project, and it was led by researchers from the University of Birmingham, working alongside Austria's Ludwig Boltzmann, Institute for Archaeological Prospection and Virtual Archaeology. They weren't digging. Digging at Stonehenge is one of the most tightly controlled archaeological activities in the world. You don't just put a shovel in the ground. Instead, they deployed ground-penetrating radar, high-resolution magnetometers, electromagnetic sensing equipment, and Earth resistance measurement tools across nearly 3,000 acres of the surrounding landscape, an area more than 4 miles square. They were building a 3-dimensional underground map of everything within a depth of about 10 feet below the surface. What they found changed the picture so dramatically that the lead scientist, Professor Vince Gaffney, said publicly, nobody had any idea this was here. Beneath the car park near Stonehenge, archaeologists found evidence of massive prehistoric posts dating back to around 8,000 BC, 3,000 years before the stones themselves were erected. 3,000 years. The site was already considered significant, already being used for large-scale ritual purposes, millennia before anyone dragged the first bluestone from Wales. This is not a footnote. This is the opening of a completely different story. Stonehenge didn't emerge from a flat cultural landscape. It was the culmination of thousands of years of ongoing activity on a site that prehistoric people had been returning to, generation after generation, for reasons we are only beginning to understand. Whatever it was about that particular place on that particular plain that drew the first people to it in 8,000 BC continued drawing people for 5,000 years after that. Something about it mattered before the stones existed. The stones, when they finally came, were an answer to something the site had already been asking for millennia. Then the radar went deeper into the surrounding landscape and found something nobody had even suspected. About 3 kilometers from Stonehenge, around a large Neolithic settlement site called Durrington Walls, researchers discovered a circle of more than 20 massive prehistoric shafts buried beneath the earth. Each shaft was over 10 meters in diameter and 5 meters deep, structures large enough to swallow a small house. They were arranged in a near-perfect geometric circle, more than 2 kilometers across, enclosing an area of over 3 square kilometers. These were not natural formations. Archaeologist Vincent Gaffney from the University of Bradford, who confirmed the shafts were human-made, was direct about it. They cannot be occurring naturally. It just can't happen. The analysis used electrical resistance tomography to determine depth, radar and magnetometry to determine shape, and core sediment samples, processed through optically stimulated luminescence to date when the soil layers were last exposed to sunlight. The evidence was unambiguous. Someone built this. Someone planned it, measured it, dug it, and maintained it. And then the earth swallowed it, and it waited in darkness for 5,000 years until a machine finally saw it. Why does this matter? Because for generations, scholars had assumed Stonehenge was essentially a standalone monument, Remarkable, yes, but a singular structure on a plain. What the Hidden Landscapes project revealed was something categorically different. Stonehenge was one component of a vast, organized ceremonial complex that covered miles of landscape, involving multiple interconnected monuments, burial mounds, settlements, processional avenues, and now these enormous buried shafts. The scale of the thing, the scale of the human enterprise that created it, was so much larger than anyone had imagined that archaeologist Richard Bates of St. Andrews University said the new discoveries offered an insight to the past that shows an even more complex society than we could ever imagine. That's a scientist saying, we were wrong about how sophisticated these people were. We were wrong about the scale. We were wrong about the coordination. We were wrong about nearly everything except the location. And that realization is where the story gets genuinely unsettling. Because what AI-assisted analysis then began to do was not just find buried features, it began finding patterns in those features. Patterns that are difficult to explain as accidental. Patterns that suggest the people who built this landscape didn't just know what they wanted the stones to look like, they knew what they wanted the entire landscape to mean, and they engineered it to deliver that meaning with a precision that took us 5,000 years, and machines more powerful than anything they could have conceived to finally detect. The Durrington Walls shafts, when fed into AI modeling systems designed to cross-reference prehistoric data at scale, appeared to align with features at Stonehenge itself in ways that suggested the two sites were in all deliberately coordinated. The circle of shafts appeared to function as a kind of boundary or threshold, a perimeter marking the edge of a sacred precinct. Inside that precinct, specific movements, specific positions, specific moments of the year would have carried different meanings. The AI systems were doing what no individual human archaeologist could do alone, processing the geometry of the entire landscape simultaneously, looking for relationships between features separated by miles, comparing the alignments at Stonehenge with the orientations of the buried shafts, the positions of the processional avenues, the layout of the burial mounds, and mapping everything against known astronomical cycles. And what emerged from that analysis was a picture of deliberate, sophisticated design operating at landscape scale. Not a monument, a system. The solar alignments alone are extraordinary when you understand them properly. Stonehenge is oriented so that at the summer solstice sunrise, the sun rises directly over the heel stone and its light floods into the center of the monument. At the winter solstice, sunset, the opposite happens. The dying sun sinks precisely between the two tallest trilithons. These alignments are not approximate, they are exact. They require precise knowledge of the solar year and a sophisticated ability to translate that knowledge into stone architecture. But here is what most people don't know. The monument at Durrington Walls, the settlement near those buried shafts, had its own timber circle oriented toward the rising sun on the midwinter solstice. And the avenue leading from that timber circle to the River Avon was aligned with the setting sun on the summer solstice. Stonehenge and Durrington Walls were architecturally mirrored, pointing at opposing solar events connected by the river that ran between them. The people who designed this didn't just understand the movements of the sun, they built a landscape-scale monument to it with multiple sites, working in deliberate architectural conversation with each other across miles of terrain, sun rising on one side of the river, sun setting on the other. The river itself becoming part of the ceremony, the threshold between the two poles of the year, the passage between life and death that the solstices were believed to represent. A 2022 analysis took this further, proposing that the arrangement of the 30 sarsen stones in Stonehenge's outer circle and the positions of the 5 central trilithons functioned as a precise solar calendar. The structure appeared to encode a 365.25-day year, meaning these Neolithic builders had calculated not just the length of the solar year, but the fractional day that accumulates into a leap year every 4 years. That level of mathematical precision in stone, placed 35,000 years ago, has caused serious scholars to fundamentally reconsider what kind of intellectual capability existed in prehistoric Britain. We had assumed these people were pre-mathematical. The stones say otherwise. The stones say they could count the days of the year to a quarter of a day and then embed that count permanently in 60 tons of sarsen rock so that anyone who came after them could look up at the sunrise and know exactly where they were in the turning of the year. And then the sound researchers arrived, and they found something that nobody had been looking for. A team from the University of Salford's Acoustics Research Center spent years building a 1:12 scale model of Stonehenge, as it would have appeared at its peak around 2200 BC, all 157 stones, reproduced in plaster mixed with plastic using 3D printing and custom molds, tested in a semi-anechoic chamber. The goal was to measure how the complete monument would have affected sound. What they found was that Stonehenge, in its original complete configuration, functioned like an acoustic chamber. The outer ring of massive sarsen uprights amplified sound and created reverberation for anyone standing inside the circle. Speech was enhanced. Music was enhanced. The experience of being inside Stonehenge when it was complete would have been sonically unlike being anywhere else in the landscape, a space where the human voice carried differently, where ceremony would have felt charged with a quality the people inside couldn't scientifically explain, but would have perceived as extraordinary. The results quantified what that meant. A mid-frequency reverberation time of 0.64 seconds and an amplification of 4.3 decibels for speech. This wasn't accidental. The placement and dimensions of the outer sarsen circle created these effects, and crucially, the sound was designed to stay inside. For those outside the circle, the sound of whatever was happening within was muted and obscured. Stonehenge was built to contain its ceremonies acoustically as well as physically. What happened inside was not meant to be heard by those standing outside. There's another layer to the acoustic story that goes even deeper. A 2017 study by the Royal College of Art found that the bluestones themselves, those smaller inner stones dragged from the Preseli Hills of Wales, have remarkable sonic properties when struck. They ring, they resonate, they produce metallic and wooden tones across multiple notes, sounds that researchers described as bells, drums, and gongs. Different sounds can be heard from different places on the same stone. These are what geologists call lithophones, ringing rocks, and their sonic qualities were almost certainly known to the people who selected them. Archaeologists have long struggled to explain why anyone would drag stones weighing several tons across 150 miles of difficult terrain when there were perfectly adequate local rocks available. The acoustic research offers the first truly compelling answer. The bluestones weren't just stones, they were instruments. They were chosen because of what they sounded like when struck during ceremony, because the sounds they made were unlike any other stones in the landscape, because the combination of their visual weight and their sonic resonance made them sacred in a way that ordinary rock simply was not. The outer sarsens created Tihi acoustic chamber. The inner bluestones provided the instruments played inside it. Stonehenge was not just a temple or a calendar, it was a concert hall built from sacred rock, engineered to amplify the voice and the drum, sealed against the outside world, pointed at the sun. This connects to another discovery that shifted the entire understanding of who these stones were for. Excavations and isotope analysis of bones and animal teeth found at Durrington Walls revealed that at the height of Stonehenge's use, between roughly 2600 and 2400 BC, as many as 4,000 people gathered at the site for midwinter and midsummer festivals. 4,000. This is not a small priestly elite conducting secret rites. This is a mass gathering of people, and the evidence shows they came from far away. Strontium isotope analysis of animals. Teeth from the site showed that some of the animals brought to these gatherings had been raised in the Scottish Highlands, hundreds of miles to the north. People were traveling the length of Britain to be here. The Monument S at Stonehenge and Durrington Walls were pilgrimage sites, places that the people of prehistoric Britain considered important enough to justify journeys of hundreds of miles, journeys that in the Neolithic period would have taken weeks on foot through, landscape that had no roads, no bridges, no infrastructure of any kind. They came anyway, generation after generation, century after century they came. Because whatever was happening at Stonehenge on those 2 days a year mattered more than the distance. It mattered more than the risk. It was, in some sense, we can no longer fully access, worth everything. Which brings us to the most disorienting discovery of all, and to the one that truly reframed what the AI analysis was revealing, where the stones themselves came from. The bluestones, the smaller inner ring of stones at Stonehenge, each weighing around 2 to 4 tons, have been traced to the Preseli Hills in Pembrokeshire, Wales, more than 150 miles from Salisbury Plain. For decades, some geologists argued that glaciers might have carried these stones part of the way, reducing the transportation challenge to a more manageable scale. In early 2026, a study from Curtin University published in the journal Communications, Earth and Environment closed that argument definitively. Using advanced mineral fingerprinting, specifically the analysis of more than 500 zircon crystals found in river sediments near Stonehenge, the researchers searched for evidence that glaciers had ever passed through the RA. They found none. The geological signature that glacial transport would have left simply was not there. The bluestones were carried by people, all the way, every mile. 150 miles of human effort, coordinated over generations, for stones that rang like bells when you struck them. And then there is the altar stone, the massive 6-ton slab at the center of Stonehenge that lies flat on the ground. A 2024 study published in Nature traced its origin not to Wales, not to anywhere in southern England, but to northeast Scotland, over 450 miles away. The altar stone came from Scotland. Someone transported a 6-ton block of sandstone 450 miles and placed it at the precise center of one of the most carefully engineered structures in prehistoric Europe. The logistical effort required to move that stone, the organization, the Coordination, the shared purpose across communities separated by hundreds of miles, implies a level of social and cultural integration in prehistoric Britain that conventional models of Neolithic society had not accounted for. These were not isolated farming communities, scraping by in separate valleys, with no knowledge of each other. These were people connected by shared belief, shared ceremony, and shared architectural vision operating at what we would today call national scale. When AI systems began cross-referencing the origins of all the stones with the astronomical alignments and the landscape geometry, the picture that emerged was of a project that spanned not just miles but generations, a monument built over centuries by successive communities who understood what their predecessors had begun and continued it with deliberate intention, trusting that the people who came after them would do the same. They were building something they would never see completed, and they built it anyway, because the idea of it was larger than any individual life. The question that no analysis has yet fully answered, the one that sits at the center of all of this data, the one that the AI can identify and quantify but cannot resolve, is the deepest one. Why? Why did they do this? Why did people from Scotland, from Wales, from across Britain converge on a plain in Wiltshire and spend centuries moving stones that weighed as much as 25 tons? Across terrain that offered no obvious path, with technology that consisted of wooden sledges and rope and the organized effort of hundreds of human bodies. Why did they build an acoustic chamber in stone? Why did they encode the solar year into the geometry of a monument that nobody was supposed to enter, unless they were among the select few, allowed through its boundary? Why were 4,000 people traveling hundreds of miles twice a year to stand near these stones? Why did the site matter before the stones even arrived? Why did it keep mattering for 3,000 years after they were raised? The honest answer is that we don't know, not fully. The data gives us precision without meaning. We can tell you that the summer solstice sunrise hits the heel stone at an angle measured to fractions of a degree. We can tell you that the altar stone weighs 5.9 tons and contains mineral signatures consistent with the Arcadian Basin in northeast Scotland. We can tell you that the reverberation time inside the complete original monument would have been 0.64 seconds. We can tell you that 20 shafts arranged in a geometrically precise ring lie buried 3 kilometers to the northeast. We can tell you that the bluestones were chosen in part because they ring like bells. We can tell you all of these things with measurement and certainty. What we cannot tell you is what the person who carried the first stone felt when they put it down, what they were reaching toward, what they believed was listening, what they thought the sun meant when it came through those stones at dawn on the longest day of the year. And that is what is genuinely unsettling about all this. Not the scale, not the precision, not the mathematical sophistication encoded in the geometry. What is unsettling is the confrontation with a fundamental truth that sharpens the more the technology reveals. These people were not primitive. They were not stumbling around in the dark before civilization arrived to enlighten them. They were building solar calendars in stone. I were engineering acoustic chambers on hilltops. They were transporting 6-ton boulders from Scotland because something about those specific boulders mattered in a way we no longer have the framework to understand. They were operating a society connected enough and organized enough to move tens of thousands of tons of rock across hundreds of miles over hundreds of years and maintain the shared vision of what they were building through generations of builders who never saw the finished result. We stood in front of this monument for 5,000 years and called it mysterious. We made up stories about druids and giants and ancient aliens because the truth, the real truth, the one that the radar and the AI and the mineral fingerprinting and the acoustic modeling are slowly assembling piece by piece, was actually harder to accept than any of those stories. The truth is that before writing, before bronze, before anything we normally call civilization, human beings were doing something on that plain in southern England that we still do not fully understand. They were doing it at a scale that staggers modern engineers. They were doing it with a precision that required mathematics we never credited them with knowing. They were doing it with acoustic sophistication we only confirmed by building a scale model in a laboratory. And they were doing it for reasons that the most sophisticated pattern recognition systems ever built can map and measure and model, but still cannot explain. That silence at the center of all the data, that unbridgeable gap between what the machines can calculate and what the stones actually mean, is the real mystery of Stonehenge. Not that we haven't cracked it yet, but the 5,000 years later, standing on the edge of the most technologically advanced civilization in human history, with artificial intelligence reading patterns in the landscape that human eyes missed for millennia, we are still looking at what those people built and realizing we are not sure we would have been capable of it ourselves. Not the engineering, not the logistics, but the belief, the sustained multi-generational belief that this was worth building, that it was worth dragging a 6-ton stone from Scotland, that it was worth 150 Wambauers, miles of effort for a stone that rang like a bell, that it was worth a journey of weeks through unmapped land twice a year for centuries. What makes the AI contribution so important is not that artificial intelligence solves Stonehenge the way a detective solves a crime. It didn't hand us a neat answer. What it did was more valuable and more humbling. It showed us how much we had missed. For generations, archaeologists worked with what they could see, what they could dig, what their eyes and instruments could reach. They mapped the visible stones. They excavated the visible graves. They measured the visible alignments. And they built theories from that evidence that were, at their best, partially correct. What AI-assisted remote sensing and pattern recognition added was the invisible layer, the 3,000 acres of underground landscape that human eyes had passed over for centuries without detecting, the geometric relationships between features separated by miles that no individual researcher could perceive, the acoustics, behavior of a complete monument that hadn't existed in that form for 4,000 years. The machines didn't replace the archaeologists, they gave them a new kind of vision. And the first thing that vision revealed was that everything we had been studying was the surface of a far deeper thing. Monument we thought we understood was an iceberg. The scanning showed us the water, and what lies beneath is so much larger, so much more deliberate, and so much more unsettling than the visible part that it forces a complete recalibration, not just about Stonehenge, but about the people who built it, and what human beings are capable of when they believe in something completely enough to dedicate generations of lives to its construction. The stones are still standing, the machine is still reading, and the answer is still somewhere in the silence between what we can measure and what we can understand.